Hey, everybody. So I'm actually going to do a broad-based gender lecture. I teach the sociology of gender class, and so I'm going to try to condense everything that's super important into one lecture. That's going to be a little challenging. It'll probably be broken up into a couple of series of lectures, but I'm going to use this for my 205 sexuality course and my intro to WGS course, and probably any other courses that I teach moving forward where there's a section on gender, because I think that this is important, broad-based information that can go along with any of the subjects that I generally teach. I'll be following along some of the things and some of the terms specifically catered to the SOC 205 textbook, but these terms are terms that are important to learn no matter what course you're in, and likely are also in the chapters on gender that are in whatever textbook we're using for that class. So bear with me because it's going to be hard for me to condense everything, but I'm going to try to be as concise as possible and go over a lot of information relatively quickly. Remember that if you have questions, you can always ask. I'm always available to answer questions. And if there's something in here that wasn't maybe in one of your textbooks or what have you, and you would like to reach out further or be like, why is this important? Or what have you, any of those are valid questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to the PowerPoint. Ignore my kids in the background of my computer screen. Let's go to view, start slideshow. Where's my song? All right. There it is. I'm like, wait, where did it go? All right. So I just, again, wanted to overwhelm you with pictures of the different variations of what it means to do gender, what it means to be a gendered body, the ideal body types, the non-ideal body types, the norms, the variations, the structures. I just wanted to throw in there a whole bunch of things for you to look at and to go through. So take your time looking at all of these things and kind of talk to yourself about what it means to be a gendered body, what it means to carry a specific gender identity, and why all of those things are different in any different circumstance, whether it be culture, time, space, interaction, what have you. Why do those characteristics that are ideal for whatever gender it is that you ascribe to, why do those change? And we're going to get into that a little more. All right. So we're going to correct some basic gender assumptions that we relatively make on a regular basis. Sorry, my kid just dropped something. And we're going to go ahead and take those and we're going to kind of squish them. And I want to do that because I think that this is super important. The Sociology 205 textbook uses the idea of a gender reveal party as something to kind of work through some of these assumptions that we make, but we're going to talk about them more broadly than that, because I think while that is an incredible example, I also think that there's a much more broad statement happening with these gender assumptions. So the first assumption is that sex and gender are the same. This is so very false. Sex is the biological category based on your anatomic features, chromosomal makeup, and hormone makeup. And so this is also a category that's not binary. So you can be intersex, have an intersex trait, which will have either a chromosomal trait that is not distinctly male or distinctly female. You can have atomic features that vary, or may have both, or may have like not distinctly either one. And have hormonal makeup that doesn't fall in the typical range. And even the typical range is highly varied depending on culture and depending on doctor's background, depending on what it is they're looking for. So what we know about humans is that no matter what the sex or gender of the human, we are far more alike than we are different. And so making these inherently very distinct categories of difference has done us to an extent a disservice in how we get to walk around and be in the world. And so what our job is to kind of distinguish the difference between sex and gender, and to walk in a way that is affirming to whatever it is that a human looks, acts, thinks, feels like, so that we can create a space for everyone, if that makes sense. And so on that note, sex is that more biological structures. Gender is a social construct that we should be, but sometimes isn't, determined by the actual individual and expressed through the adherence or to the queering of societal expectations of specific categories through behaviors, interactions with others, and social performance. And that's a really long way of saying gender is how we walk through the world. It's the way we dress, it's the way we talk, it's the mannerisms we have in our interactions with other people, it's the way we sit, it's the makeup we choose or not to choose put on our face, it's the music we listen to, it's the colors that we choose. I chose green today. Clearly I'm not following the gendered notion of what female color schemes should be. I like the color green, so I wore it anyway. But we choose our performances, we choose our choices based on both things that we have been learned and taught to be, and then we also do it based on our intention of expressing who we are through our actions, our choices, our appearance, our way of life, really. And sometimes we do it without even thinking about doing it, right? So say you go into a doctor's office and a male figure in like medical clothing, so your scrubs or whatever, comes in the door. When you first see that person, are you going to assume that person is the doctor or the nurse? We do that based on these automatic assumptions that we have been taught. The reason we make whatever assumption it is, and now if you work in the medical field, you may have a different assumption because you've learned a different pattern of behavior. You're going to tell by the color, the type of badge they have on, maybe some other things. But the way that we inherently make choices is based on how society has taught us to make those choices and what those choices are supposed to represent. And that's what we're going to get into. So sex and gender are not the same thing. And those two things are expressed in different ways. One is social and one is biological. And these are very distinct differences. Next, a fetus sex is always one sex to the other. And that's false. Again, intersex individuals make up 1.7% of the population. So they make up roughly the same percentage of the population as true redheads. Just for argument's sake, how many redheads do you know? Think about that for a minute and think about the amount of intersex individuals you may or may not know, because they may not disclose that information to you, and or it may not be something pertinent to the interaction that you have with them. But because they make up 1.7% of the population, that is a large enough category to really think through why it is we are still trying to determine that sex is just male or just female. And that doesn't accurately represent our population. And so what ends up happening is that you have infants that are born intersex, and doctors are making choices on what their sex is going to be, based and making surgical changes to a person that may not be based on their hormone levels, because they may not have, I mean, obviously they haven't gone through puberty. There's things that might change, that they don't have any say on what their gender might be. And these things have long-term consequences, which we will get into in other points for each one of these classes. The third assumption is that gender is innate and unchanging and biologically driven. Okay, we've already talked about the fact that they're not biologically driven, right? Because this is based on how we have learned to be a specific way, right? So from birth, when you go into those like baby showers, if you tell them you are having a boy or a girl, what are the options for that baby or that young kid? As you're buying clothes, your family members are going to buy them clothes, you're going to buy them clothes. What options did you give them to express their gender, and what gender choices did you make for them? And this is why I say that it's a social construct that should be determined by the individual, but in a lot of cases, especially in young children's cases, that's determined for them, and their choices are determined for them based on what we give them. And that's And again, gender is that social construct, and it varies very much between time and space, interaction, and culture. So when you looked at that first screen, you see men in kilts, right? Or you see women that are maybe more covered up or less covered up, or maybe some are wearing religious garments, some are wearing bikinis that have barely anything on, right? You're going to see a very different variation of what it means to be female, what it means to express femininity. You're going to see a difference in body style. You're going to see a difference in how one's hair is made, whether or not you even see their hair. What makeup looks like, if it looks like something you're supposed to do at all, whether or not you wear a kilt or pants, whether or not women are allowed to wear pants. All of these things are constructed based on culture. And even within American culture, which American culture is deprived of so many different cultures, and I don't think that there's distinctly one. But even if you look at broad-based understandings within our society, women couldn't wear pants for a very, very long time. It was not something that was inherently part of being what we call inherently part of being female. But yet now it's socially acceptable, and like actually there's an entire fashion industry surrounding jeans for women. So these things can change. And what we mean by a social construct is that society determines what it means to be in any given category or out of a category. And these things very much have changed over time. And we're going to keep talking about that as we move forward in some of our other sections. And then our last assumption is that sex and gender are binary categories. Again, we've talked about this several times throughout this slide, so I'm not going to keep going over this. But again, an intersex individual in and of itself breaks down that idea that sex is a inherently two category or binary category idea, and gender, because it is so unchanging and because there's so much space in between and we have more alike similarities as humans than we do differences, it is much more likely that gender is more fluid and has less distinct two categories and more ability to play with and merge through multiple different expressions, understandings, and ways of life. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for this one, and then we're going to get into some terminology in the next one, and I don't want to overwhelm you, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. And then, because I think that that's a lot to process, and that's some very big ideas. So again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask.